Late last month, State Senator Steve Glazier offered this advice on Twitter, urging to hold a recall election sooner rather than later, while Gavin Newsom is faring well with things like vaccine distribution and the budget. Might the state legislature have taken that advice to heart? For more on this, we are joined by Emily Hoven of CalMatters. Emily, it is great to have you with us here on Inside the Issues.
Thanks for having me. Thrilled to be here.
I have to say, it's been so fascinating watching the prospect of this recall election evolve. It seems like for a long time, the conventional political wisdom was that the governor kind of wanted to try to run out the clock, right? The longer we wait, the more time that Gavin Newsom would have to rebuild California, the lower our case numbers and deaths due to the pandemic would be. And then suddenly things changed. What happened?
Yeah, it kind of was an abrupt turn, but some lawmakers started saying it actually might be advantageous for the governor to move up that recall election. If it were held in August or early September, then the whole issue of like fall school reopenings may not be as big of a deal. It would allow him to potentially avoid the worst of the drought of wildfire season, rolling blackouts when like what happened last year when the temperatures got so high and the grid was strained. And so it appears that Democratic lawmakers have actually taken this advice to heart because they have taken steps to push up the date of the recall election to as early as late August or early September. So it's been a really fascinating turn of events.
Yeah. And remind us, because this is where it gets a little bit wonky, but it's really important because this is a recall election in terms of setting the date. What role does the state legislature play? Because they're kind of holding the purse strings. Elections cost money, right?
They do. And they actually, strangely enough, they basically write the laws that govern this process. And so a couple of years ago, there was actually a Democratic state senator who was up for a recall, and the legislature added a bunch of steps to the recall process, basically to make it longer. And as we were saying before, that was the traditional thought that that would be helpful. But now that they've sort of had this change of heart, they are actually taking steps to waive the very rules they passed just a few years ago and push that election up. And as you pointed out, they also do allocate money for those elections. This is actually emerging as a big point of contention because the counties, which are in charge of actually administering these elections on the ground, with polling places and ballots and things of that nature, they're saying, hey, this is going to cost us a lot of money and we don't really have the budget for this. And so the legislature said, okay, well, we're going to put $250 million in the budget for the state and for the counties to conduct this election. But there are still other problems, and that's going to be the timing, because the registrars of the counties are saying, well, it's all well and good that we have some money now, but we don't have enough time to get all the ballots. Apparently there's like a shortage of ballots and they aren't going to have enough time to find a manufacturer. They need to find workers, need to train workers. They need to figure out where they're going to actually have the physical polling centers. So there are a lot of logistical challenges.
A ton of logistical challenges. I'm going to kind of use this as a segue to talk about our next topic, one that you've been covering a lot of there at CalMatters, which has to do with the EDD. Of course, this is the state agency responsible for doling out benefits. And all of this is kind of tied together because they need people to work the elections. Of course, there's a million other businesses right now that also need people with the big reopening of California this week. What does all of this portend, Emily, in terms of employment here in California and the EDD?
It's a really fascinating and in some ways paradoxical situation, because as the state is reopening, you are seeing businesses frantically hiring. I mean, everywhere you go, you see hiring, help wanted, on all these different types of restaurants and stores. And interestingly, even though California has one of the highest unemployment rates in the nation, there are not a lot of people applying for these open jobs. And part of the reason for that, it seems to be, is that the wages that those jobs are paying are just not enough for a lot of workers who are, trying to afford a house in California, which is an extremely expensive market. But there is this really big gap in people that are not applying for these jobs. And interestingly, that is also impacting the unemployment department, because a lot of people are still filing unemployment claims, even though the state is reopening. And the department, despite being a year and a half into this whole situation, has never really been able to reduce the amount of backlogged claims that it has. Actually, last week was the first time in 2 months that it made any sort of headway on reducing that backlog. And so maybe that trend will continue, maybe it won't. But the fact of the matter is, it still has over 200,000 claims that have been waiting on its desk for more than 3 weeks without any action whatsoever.
Yeah, and just a reminder, behind each one of those claims is an actual human being whose life, their rent, food on the table depends on that. Emily, I want to ask you about another employment workplace scenario, which has to do with face coverings. And anybody who's been keeping up with this, we've talked about it here on the show, it's been soups confusing, right? Because on the one hand, this week marks our big reopening, and now the only people who are required to wear face coverings are those who are unvaccinated. And yet, there's been some confusion about what happens at the workplace and how do you know whether or not someone's vaccinated and all the rest of it. You have been following this, especially in terms of CalOSHA, the agency that oversees our workplace rules. Can you kind of recap for us what's been going on here?
Yes, I think it's kind of a funny thing because CalOSHA itself doesn't really seem to really know what's going on. And part of the reason for that is they, in the past 2 weeks, have reversed their own decisions on whether workers should wear masks 3 different times. Numerous times they've asked, what are we voting on? They've asked what's going to happen June 15th. And I think for the public, that's really confusing because they're saying, well, shouldn't you be telling us what's going to happen on June 15th? And so the current status is that workers, whether they're vaccinated or not, still have to wear masks. But actually, the agency tomorrow is going to be taking a vote on whether to allow unvaccinated workers, or vaccinated workers, to go maskless. But what is interesting about that too is that businesses, individual companies, will still have the discretion to decide whether or not their employees should wear masks. And the governor is poised to take executive action to basically codify those CalOSHA rules really fast, because due to a weird bureaucratic thing, if he didn't do that, they would have had to wait another 2 weeks before they went into effect. So it's a very complex situation, but CalOSHA is expected tomorrow to allow fully vaccinated workers to go without masks.
And then let me see if I remember my dates right, Emily, because there's so many of them between recall dates and budgets passing and all the rest of it. If they approve it, am I right that it would then take effect, I believe, June 28th, right? Is that the date that it would be officially okay to have these no mask rules?
So that's the day that it would become official if the governor did not take executive action to basically codify that and make it law the second it happens, which he has said he's going to do, I think, to avoid further confusion and kind of arbitrary dates. So if they do indeed pass tomorrow these new rules, the governor would then sign an order making them effective immediately. So presumably the next day they would go into effect.
It's so much to keep track of. And Emily Hoven of CalMatters, we are so grateful that you are keeping an eye on it all. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.